Part 4, Section 9 of the Freedom of the Will by Jonathan Edwards. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Concerning that objection against the doctrine which has been maintained that it makes God the author of sin. It is urged by Arminians that the doctrine of the necessity of men's volitions, or their necessary connection with antecedent events and circumstances, makes the first cause and supreme orderer of all things the author of sin, in that he has so constituted the state and course of things that sinful volitions become necessary in consequence of his disposal. Dr. Whitby, in his discourse on the freedom of the will, cites one of the ancients as on his side, declaring that this opinion of the necessity of the will absolves sinners as doing nothing of their own accord which was evil, and would cast all the blame of all the wickedness committed in the world upon God and upon his providence, if that were admitted by the assertors of this fate, whether he himself did necessitate them to do these things, or ordered matters so that they should be constrained to do them by some other cause. And the doctor says in another place, in the nature of the thing and in the opinion of philosophers, causa deficiens in rebus necessarius ad causam per se efficientem reducenda est. In things necessary, the deficient cause must be reduced to the efficient. And in this case the reason is evident, because the not doing what is required, or not avoiding what is forbidden, being a defect, must follow from the position of the necessary cause of that deficiency. Concerning this I would observe the following things. 1. If there be any difficulty in this matter, it is nothing peculiar to this scheme. It is no difficulty or disadvantage wherein it is distinguished from the scheme of Arminians, and therefore not reasonably objected by them. Dr. Whitby supposes that if sin necessarily follows from God withholding assistance, or if that assistance be not given which is absolutely necessary to the avoiding of evil, then in the nature of the thing God must be as properly the author of that evil as if he were the efficient cause of it. From whence, according to what he himself says of the devils and damned spirits, God must be the proper author of their perfect unrestrained wickedness. He must be the efficient cause of the great pride of the devils, and of their perfect malignity against God, Christ, his saints, and all that is good, and of the insatiable cruelty of their disposition. For he allows that God has so forsaken them, and does so withhold his assistance from them, that they are incapacitated from doing good, and determined only to evil. Our doctrine, in its consequence, makes God the author of men's sin in this world no more, and in no other sense than his doctrine, in its consequence, makes God the author of the hellish pride and malice of the devils, and doubtless the latter is as odious an effect as the former. Again, if it will follow at all that God is the author of sin from what has been supposed of a sure and infallible connection between antecedents and consequence, it will follow because of this, viz., that for God to be the author or orderer of those things which he knows beforehand will infallibly be attended with such a consequence, is the same thing in effect as for him to be the author of that consequence. But if this be so, this is a difficulty which equally attends the doctrine of Arminians themselves, at least of those of them who allow God's certain foreknowledge of all events. For on the supposition of such a foreknowledge, this is the case with respect to every sin that is committed. God knew that if he ordered and brought to pass such and such events, such sins would infallibly follow. As for instance, God certainly foreknew long before Judas was born that if he ordered things so, that there should be such a man born at such a time and at such a place, and that his life should be preserved, and that he should, in divine providence, be led into acquaintance with Jesus, and that his heart should be so influenced by God's Spirit or providence as to be inclined to be a follower of Christ, and that he should be one of those 12 which should be chosen constantly to attend him as his family, and that his health should be preserved so that he should go up to Jerusalem at the last Passover in Christ's life, and it should be so ordered that Judas should see Christ's kind treatment of the woman which anointed him at Bethany, and have that reproof from Christ which he had at that time, and see and hear other things which excited his enmity against his master, and other circumstances should be ordered as they were ordered, it would most certainly and infallibly follow that Judas would betray his Lord, and would soon after hang himself and die impenitent, and be sent to hell for his horrid wickedness. Therefore this supposed difficulty ought not to be brought as an objection against the scheme which has been maintained as disagreeing with the Arminian scheme, seeing it is no difficulty owing to such a disagreement, but a difficulty wherein the Arminians share with us, that must be unreasonably made an objection against our differing from them, which we should not escape or avoid at all by agreeing with them. And therefore I would observe, 2. They who object that this doctrine makes God the author of sin ought distinctly to explain what they mean by that phrase, the author of sin. I know the phrase, as it is commonly used, signifies something very ill. If by the author of sin be meant the sinner, the agent or actor of sin, or the doer of a wicked thing, so it would be a reproach and blasphemy to suppose God to be the author of sin. In this sense I utterly deny God to be the author of sin, rejecting such an imputation on the Most High as what is infinitely to be abhorred, and deny any such thing to be the consequence of what I have laid down. But if by the author of sin is meant the permitter, or not a hinderer of sin, and at the same time a disposer of the state of events in such a manner for wise, holy, and most excellent ends and purposes, that sin, if it be permitted or not hindered, will most certainly and infallibly follow. I say, if this be all that is meant by being the author of sin, I do not deny that God is the author of sin, though I dislike and reject the phrase as that which, by use and custom, is apt to carry another sense. It is no reproach for the Most High to be thus the author of sin. This is not to be the actor of sin, but on the contrary of holiness. What God doth herein is holy, and a glorious exercise of the infinite excellency of his nature. And I do not deny that God being thus the author of sin follows from what I have laid down, and I assert that it equally follows from the doctrine which is maintained by most of the Arminian divines. That it is most certainly so that God is in such a manner the disposer and orderer of sin is evident, if any credit is to be given to the Scripture, as well as because it is impossible in the nature of things to be otherwise. In such a manner God ordered the obstinacy of Pharaoh in his refusing to obey God's commands to let the people go. Exodus 4:21. I will harden his heart, and he shall not let the people go. Chapter 7, 2-5. Aaron thy brother shall speak unto Pharaoh that he send the children of Israel out of his land, and I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and multiply my signs and my wonders in the land of Egypt. But Pharaoh shall not hearken unto you, that I may lay mine hand upon Egypt by great judgments, etc. Chapter 9:12. And the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, and he hearkened not unto them, as the Lord had spoken unto Moses. Chapter 10:1-2. And the Lord said unto Moses, Go in unto Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart and the heart of his servants, that I might show these my signs before him, and that thou mayest tell it in the ears of thy son and thy son's son, what things I have wrought in Egypt, and my signs which I have done amongst them, that ye may know that I am the Lord. Chapter 14:4. And I will harden Pharaoh's heart, that he shall follow after them, and I will be honored upon Pharaoh and upon all his host. Verse 8. And the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he pursued after the children of Israel. And it is certain that in such a manner God, for wise and good ends, ordered that event, Joseph being sold into Egypt by his brethren. Genesis 45:5. Now therefore be not grieved, nor angry with yourselves, that ye sold me hither, for God did send me before you to preserve life. Verse 7-8. God did send me before you to preserve a posterity in the earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance, so that now it was not you that sent me hither, but God. Psalms 107:17. He sent a man before them, even Joseph, who was sold for a servant. It is certain that thus God ordered the sin and folly of Sihon, king of the Amorites, in refusing to let the people of Israel pass by him peaceably. Deuteronomy 2:30. But Sihon, king of Heshbon, would not let us pass by him, for the Lord thy God hardened his spirit and made his heart obstinate, that he might deliver him into thine hand. It is certain that God thus ordered the sin and folly of the kings of Canaan, that they attempted not to make peace with Israel, but with a stupid boldness and obstinacy set themselves violently to oppose them and their God. Joshua 11:20. For it was of the Lord to harden their hearts, that they should come against Israel in battle, that he might destroy them utterly, and that they might have no favor, but that he might destroy them, as the Lord commanded Moses. It is evident that thus God ordered the treacherous rebellion of Zedekiah against the king of Babylon. Jeremiah 52:3. For through the anger of the Lord it came to pass in Jerusalem and Judah, until he had cast them out from his presence, that Zedekiah rebelled against the king of Babylon. So 2 Kings 24:20. And it is exceeding manifest that God thus ordered the rapine and unrighteous ravages of Nebuchadnezzar in spoiling and ruining the nations round about. Jeremiah 25:9. Behold, I will send and take all the families of the north, saith the Lord, and Nebuchadnezzar my servant, and will bring them against this land and against all the nations round about, and will utterly destroy them, and make them an astonishment and an hissing and perpetual desolations. Chapter 43:10-11. I will send and take Nebuchadnezzar the king of Babylon my servant, and I will set his throne upon these stones that I have hid, and he shall spread his royal pavilion over them. And when he cometh, he shall smite the land of Egypt, and deliver such as are for death to death, and such as are for captivity to captivity, and such as are for the sword to the sword. Thus God represents himself as sending for Nebuchadnezzar, and taking him and his armies, and bringing him against the nations, which were to be destroyed by him, to that very end, that he might utterly destroy them, and make them desolate, and as appointing the work that he should do so particularly, that the very persons were designed that he should kill with the sword, and those that should be killed with famine and pestilence, and those that should be carried into captivity, and that in doing all these things he should act as his servant, by which less cannot be intended than that he should serve his purposes and designs. And in Jeremiah 27:4-6, God declares how he would cause him thus to serve his designs, viz., by bringing this to pass in his sovereign disposals, as the great possessor and governor of the universe, that disposes all things just as pleases him. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, I have made the earth, the man, and the beast that are upon the ground, by my great power and my stretched out arm, and have given it unto whom it seemed meet unto me. And now I have given all these lands into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar my servant, and the beasts of the field have I given also to serve him. And Nebuchadnezzar is spoken of as doing these things by having his arm strengthened by God, and having God's sword put into his hands for this end. Ezekiel 30:24, 25, 26. Yea, God speaks of his terribly ravaging and wasting the nations, and cruelly destroying all sorts, without distinction of sex or age, as the weapon in God's hand, and the instrument of his indignation, which God makes use of to fulfill his own purposes and execute his own vengeance. Jeremiah 51:20, etc. Thou art my battle axe and weapons of war, for with thee will I break in pieces the nations, and with thee I will destroy kingdoms, and with thee I will break in pieces the horse and his rider, and with thee I will break in pieces the chariot and his rider. With thee also will I break in pieces man and woman, and with thee I will break in pieces old and young, and with thee will I break in pieces the young man and the maid, etc. It is represented that the designs of Nebuchadnezzar and those that destroyed Jerusalem never could have been accomplished had not God determined them. Lamentations 3:37. Who is he that saith, and it cometh to pass, and the Lord commandeth it not? And yet the king of Babylon, thus destroying the nations, and especially the Jews, is spoken of as his great wickedness, for which God finally destroyed him. Isaiah 14:4-6, 12, Habakkuk 2:5-12, and Jeremiah chapter 50 and 51. It is most manifest that God, to serve his own designs, providentially ordered Shimei's cursing of David. 2 Samuel 16:10-11. The Lord hath said unto him, Curse David, let him curse, for the Lord hath bidden him. It is certain that God thus, for excellent, holy, gracious ends, ordered the fact which they committed who were concerned in Christ's death, and that therein they did but fulfill God's designs. As I trust no Christian will deny it was the design of God that Christ should be crucified, and that for this end he came into the world. It is very manifest by many scriptures that the whole affair of Christ's crucifixion, with its circumstances and the treachery of Judas that made way for it, was ordered in God's providence in pursuance of his purpose, notwithstanding the violence that is used with those plain scriptures to obscure and pervert the sense of them. Acts 2:23. Him being delivered by the determinate counsel and foreknowledge of God, ye have taken and with wicked hands have crucified and slain. Luke 22:21, 22. But behold, the hand of him that betrayeth me is with me on the table, and truly the Son of Man goeth as it was determined. Acts 4:27, 28. For of a truth against the Holy Child Jesus, whom thou hast anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, with the Gentiles and the people of Israel, were gathered together for to do whatsoever thy hand and thy counsel determined before to be done. Acts 3:17, 18. And now, brethren, I wot that through ignorance ye did it, as did also your rulers. But these things which God before had showed by the mouth of all his prophets, that Christ should suffer, he hath so fulfilled. So that what these murderers of Christ did is spoken of as what God brought to pass or ordered, and that by which he fulfilled his own word. In Revelations 17:17, the agreeing of the kings of the earth to give their kingdom to the beast, though it was a very wicked thing in them, is spoken of as fulfilling God's will, and what God had put into their hearts to do. It is manifest that God sometimes permits sin to be committed, and at the same time orders things so that if he permits the fact it will come to pass, because on some accounts he sees it needful and of importance that it should come to pass. Matthew 18:7. It must needs be that offences come, but woe to that man by whom the offence cometh. With 1 Corinthians 11:19. For there must also be heresies among you, that they which are approved may be made manifest among you. Thus it is certain and demonstrable from the Holy Scriptures, as well as the nature of things and the principles of Arminians, that God permits sin, and at the same time so orders things in his providence that it certainly and infallibly will come to pass in consequence of his permission. I proceed to observe in the next place, 3. That there is a great difference between God being concerned thus by his permission in an event and act, which in the inherent subject and agent of it is sin, though the event will certainly follow on his permission, and his being concerned in it by producing it and exerting the act of sin, or between his being the orderer of its certain existence by not hindering it under certain circumstances, and his being the proper actor or author of it by a positive agency or efficiency. And this notwithstanding what Dr. Whitby offers about a saying of philosophers, that causa deficiens in rebus necessarius ad causam per se efficientem reducenda est, as there is a vast difference between the sun being the cause of the lightsomeness and warmth of the atmosphere, and the brightness of gold and diamonds by its presence and positive influence, and its being the occasion of darkness and frost in the night by its motion whereby it descends below the horizon. The motion of the sun is the occasion of the latter kind of events, but it is not the proper cause, efficient, or producer of them, though they are necessarily consequent on that motion. Under such circumstances, no more is any action of the divine being the cause of the evil of men's wills. If the sun were the proper cause of cold and darkness, it would be the fountain of these things, as it is the fountain of light and heat. And then something might be argued from the nature of cold and darkness to a likeness of nature in the sun, and it might be justly inferred that the sun itself is dark and cold, and that his beams are black and frosty. But from its being the cause no otherwise than by its departure, no such thing can be inferred, but the contrary. It may justly be argued that the sun is a bright and hot body, if cold and darkness are found to be the consequence of its withdrawment. And the more constantly and necessarily these effects are connected with and confined to its absence, the more strongly does it argue the sun to be the fountain of light and heat. So, inasmuch as sin is not the fruit of any positive agency or influence of the Most High, but on the contrary arises from the withholding of his action and energy, and under certain circumstances necessarily follows on the want of his influence, this is no argument that he is sinful, or his operation evil, or has anything of the nature of evil, but on the contrary, that he and his agency are altogether good and holy, and that he is the fountain of all holiness. It would be strange arguing indeed, because men never commit sin but only when God leaves them to themselves, and necessarily sin when he does so, that therefore their sin is not from themselves but from God, and so that God must be a sinful being. As strange as it would be to argue, because it is always dark when the sun is gone, and never dark when the sun is present, that therefore all darkness is from the sun, and that his disk and beams must needs be black. For it properly belongs to the supreme and absolute governor of the universe to order all important events within his dominion by his wisdom, but the events in the moral world are of the most important kind, such as the moral actions of intelligent creatures and their consequences. These events will be ordered by something. They will either be disposed by wisdom, or they will be disposed by chance, that is, they will be disposed by blind and undesigning causes, if that were possible, and could be called a disposal. Is it not better that the good and evil which happen in God's world should be ordered, regulated, bounded, and determined by the good pleasure of an infinitely wise being, who perfectly comprehends within his understanding and constant view the universality of things in all their extent and duration, and sees all the influence of every event with respect to every individual thing and circumstance throughout the grand system and the whole of the eternal series of consequences, than to leave these things to fall out by chance, and to be determined by those causes which have no understanding or aim? Doubtless in these important events there is a better and a worse as to the time, subject, place, manner, and circumstances of their coming to pass, with regard to their influence on the state and course of things. And if there be, it is certainly best that they should be determined to that time, place, etc., which is best, and therefore it is in its own nature fit that wisdom and not chance should order these things, so that it belongs to the being who is the possessor of infinite wisdom, and is the creator and owner of the whole system of created existences, and has the care of all. I say it belongs to him to take care of this matter, and he would not do what is proper for him if he should neglect it. And it is so far from being unholy in him to undertake this affair, that it would rather have been unholy to neglect it, as it would have been a neglecting what fitly appertains to him, and so it would have been a very unfit and unsuitable neglect. Therefore the sovereignty of God doubtless extends to this matter, especially considering that if God should leave men's volitions and all moral events to the determination and disposition of blind, unmeaning causes, or they should be left to happen perfectly without a cause, this would be no more consistent with liberty in any notion of it, and particularly not in the Arminian notion of it, than if these events were subject to the disposal of divine providence, and the will of man were determined by circumstances which are ordered and disposed by divine wisdom, as appears by what has been already observed. But it is evident that such a providential disposing and determining of men's moral actions, though it infers a moral necessity of those actions, yet it does not in the least infringe the real liberty of mankind, the only liberty that common sense teaches to be necessary to moral agency, which, as has been demonstrated, is not inconsistent with such necessity. On the whole, it is manifest that God may be, in the manner which has been described, the orderer and disposer of that event, which, in the inherent subject and agent, is moral evil, and yet his so doing may be no moral evil. He may will the disposal of such an event, and its coming to pass for good ends, and his will not be an immoral or sinful will, but a perfect holy will. And he may actually in his providence so dispose and permit things that the event may be certainly and infallibly connected with such disposal and permission, and his act therein not be an immoral or unholy, but a perfectly holy act. Sin may be an evil thing, and yet that there should be such a disposal and permission as that it should come to pass may be a good thing. This is no contradiction or inconsistence. Joseph's brethren, selling him into Egypt, consider it only as it were acted by them, and with respect to their views and aims, which were evil, was a very bad thing. But it was a good thing, as it was an event of God's ordering, and considered with respect to his views and aims, which were good. Genesis 50:20. As for you, ye thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good. So the crucifixion of Christ, if we consider only those things which belong to the event as it proceeded from his murderers, and are comprehended within the compass of the affair, considered as their act, their principles, dispositions, views, and aims, so it was one of the most heinous things that ever was done, in many respects the most horrid of all acts. But consider it as it was willed and ordered of God, in the extent of his designs and views, it was the most admirable and glorious of all events, and God willing the event was the most holy volition of God that ever was made known to men, and God's act in ordering it was a divine act, which, above all others, manifests the moral excellency of the divine being. The consideration of these things may help us to a sufficient answer to the cavils of Arminians concerning what has been supposed by many Calvinists of a distinction between a secret and revealed will of God, and their diversity one from the other, supposing that the Calvinists herein ascribe inconsistent wills to the Most High, which is without any foundation. God's secret and revealed will, or in other words, his disposing and precepted will, may be diverse and exercised in dissimilar acts, the one in disapproving and opposing, the other in willing and determining, without any inconsistence. Because although these dissimilar exercises of the divine will may in some respects relate to the same things, yet in strictness they have different and contrary objects, the one evil and the other good. Thus, for instance, the crucifixion of Christ was a thing contrary to the revealed or preceptive will of God, because as it was viewed and done by his malignant murderers, it was a thing infinitely contrary to the holy nature of God, and so necessarily contrary to the holy inclination of his heart revealed in his law. Yet this does not at all hinder but that the crucifixion of Christ, considered with all those glorious consequences which were within the view of the divine omniscience, might be indeed, and therefore might appear to God to be a glorious event, and consequently be agreeable to his will, though this will may be secret, that is, not revealed in God's law. And thus considered, the crucifixion of Christ was not evil but good. If the secret exercises of God's will were of a kind that is dissimilar and contrary to his revealed will, respecting the same or like objects, if the objects of both were good or both evil, then indeed to ascribe contrary kinds of volition or inclination to God respecting these objects would be to ascribe an inconsistent will to God. But to ascribe to him different and opposite exercises of heart respecting different objects, and objects contrary one to another, is so far from supposing God's will to be inconsistent with itself, then it cannot be supposed consistent with itself any other way. For any being to have a will of choice respecting good, and at the same time a will of rejection and refusal respecting evil, is to be very consistent. But the contrary, viz., to have the same will towards these contrary objects, and to choose and love both good and evil at the same time, is to be very inconsistent. There is no inconsistence in supposing that God may hate a thing as it is in itself, and consider it simply as evil, and yet that it may be his will it should come to pass, considering all consequences. I believe there is no person of good understanding who will venture to say he is certain that it is impossible, it should be best, taking in the whole compass and extent of existence and all consequences in the endless series of events, that there should be such a thing as moral evil in the world. And if so, it will certainly follow that an infinitely wise being, who always chooses what is best, must choose that there should be such a thing. And if so, then such a choice is not evil, but a wise and holy choice. And if so, then the providence which is agreeable to such a choice is a wise and holy providence. Men do will sin as sin, and so are the authors and actors of it. They love it as sin, and for evil ends and purposes. God does not will sin as sin, or for the sake of anything evil, though it be his pleasure so to order things that, he permitting, sin will come to pass for the sake of the great good that by his disposal shall be the consequence. His willing to order things so that evil should come to pass for the sake of the contrary good is no argument that he does not hate evil as evil, and if so, then it is no reason why he may not reasonably forbid evil as evil and punish it as such. The Arminians themselves must be obliged, whether they will or no, to allow a distinction of God's will amounting to just the same thing that Calvinists intend by their distinction of a secret and revealed will. They must allow a distinction of those things which God thinks best should be, considering all circumstances and consequences, and so are agreeable to his disposing will, and those things which he loves, and are agreeable to his nature in themselves considered. Who is there that will dare to say that the hellish pride, malice, and cruelty of devils are agreeable to God, and what he likes and approves? And yet I trust there is no Christian divine but will allow that it is agreeable to God's will so to order and dispose things concerning them, so to leave them to themselves, and give them up to their own wickedness, that this perfect wickedness should be a necessary consequence. Dr. Whitby's words plainly suppose and allow it. These following things may be laid down as maxims of plain truth and indisputable evidence. 1. That God is a perfectly happy being in the most absolute and highest sense possible. 2. That it will follow from hence that God is free from everything that is contrary to happiness, and so that in strict propriety of speech there is no such thing as any pain, grief, or trouble in God. 3. When any intelligent being is really crossed and disappointed, and things are contrary to what he truly desires, he is the less pleased or has less pleasure. His pleasure and happiness is diminished, and he suffers what is disagreeable to him, or is the subject of something that is of a nature contrary to joy and happiness, even pain and grief. From this last axiom it follows that if no distinction is to be admitted between God's hatred of sin and his will with respect to the event and the existence of sin, as the all-wise determiner of all events, under the view of all consequences, through the whole compass and series of things, I say, then, it certainly follows that the coming to pass of every individual act of sin is truly, all things considered, contrary to his will, and that his will is really crossed in it, and this in proportion as he hates it. And as God's hatred of sin is infinite, by reason of the infinite contrariety of his holy nature to sin, so his will is infinitely crossed in every act of sin that happens, which is as much as to say he endures that which is infinitely disagreeable to him by means of every act of sin that he sees committed, and therefore, as appears by the preceding positions, he endures truly and really infinite grief or pain from every sin, and so he must be infinitely crossed and suffer infinite pain every day. In millions of instances, he must continually be the subject of an immense number of real and truly infinitely great crosses and vexations, which would be to make him infinitely the most miserable of all beings. If any objector should say, all that these things amount to is that God may do evil that good may come, which is justly esteemed immoral and sinful in men, and therefore may be justly esteemed inconsistent with the moral perfections of God, I answer that for God to dispose and permit evil in the manner that has been spoken of is not to do evil that good may come, for it is not to do evil at all. In order to a thing being morally evil, there must be one of these things belonging to it. Either it must be a thing unfit and unsuitable in its own nature, or it must have a bad tendency, or it must proceed from an evil disposition and be done for an evil end. But neither of these things can be attributed to God's ordering and permitting such events as the immoral acts of creatures for good ends. 1. It is not unfit in its own nature that he should do so, for it is in its own nature fit that infinite wisdom and not blind chance should dispose moral good and evil in the world. And it is fit that the being who has infinite wisdom and is the maker, owner, and supreme governor of the world should take care of that matter, and therefore there is no unfitness or unsuitableness in his doing it. It may be unfit and so immoral for any other beings to go about to order this affair, because they are not possessed of a wisdom that in any manner fits them for it, and in other respects they are not fit to be trusted with this affair, nor does it belong to them, they not being the owners and lords of the universe. We need not be afraid to affirm that if a wise and good man knew with absolute certainty it would be best, all things considered, that there should be such a thing as moral evil in the world, it would not be contrary to his wisdom and goodness for him to choose that it should be so. It is no evil desire to desire good, and to desire that which, all things considered, is best. And it is no unwise choice to choose that that should be which it is best should be, and to choose the existence of that thing concerning which this is known, viz., that it is best it should be, and so is known in the whole to be most worthy to be chosen. On the contrary, it would be a plain defect in wisdom and goodness for him not to choose it, and the reason why he might not order it, if he were able, would not be because he might not desire it, but only the ordering of that matter does not belong to him. But it is no harm for him who is by right and in the greatest propriety the supreme orderer of all things, to order everything in such a manner as it would be a point of wisdom in him to choose that they should be ordered. If it would be a plain defect of wisdom and goodness in a being not to choose that that should be, which he certainly knows it would, all things considered, be best should be, as was but now observed, then it must be impossible for a being who has no defect of wisdom and goodness to do otherwise than choose it should be, and that for this very reason, because he is perfectly wise and good. And if it be agreeable to perfect wisdom and goodness for him to choose that it should be, and the ordering of all things supremely and perfectly belongs to him, it must be agreeable to infinite wisdom and goodness to order that it should be. If the choice is good, the ordering and disposing things according to that choice must also be good. It can be no harm in one to whom it belongs to do his will in the armies of heaven and amongst the inhabitants of the earth to execute a good volition. If this will be good, and the object of his will be, all things considered, good and best, then the choosing or willing it is not willing evil, that good may come. And if so, then his ordering according to that will is not doing evil, that good may come. 2. It is not of a bad tendency for the Supreme Being thus to order and permit that moral evil to be, which it is best should come to pass. For that it is of good tendency is the very thing supposed in the point now in question. Christ's crucifixion, though a most horrid fact in them that perpetrated it, was of a most glorious tendency as permitted and ordered of God. 3. Nor is there any need of supposing it proceeds from any evil disposition or aim, for by the supposition what is aimed at is good, and good is the actual issue in the final result of things. End of Part 4, Section 9. Part 4, Section 10 of the Freedom of the Will by Jonathan Edwards. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Concerning sin's first entrance into the world. The things which have already been offered may serve to obviate or clear many of the objections which might be raised concerning sin's first coming into the world, as though it would follow from the doctrine maintained that God must be the author of the first sin through his so disposing things that it should necessarily follow from his permission that the sinful act should be committed, etc. I need not therefore stand to repeat what has been said already about such a necessity not proving God to be the author of sin in any ill sense or in any such sense as to infringe any liberty of man concerned in his moral agency or capacity of blame, guilt, and punishment. But should it nevertheless be said that if God, when he had made man, might so order his circumstances that from these, together with his withholding further assistance and divine influence, his sin would infallibly follow, why might not God as well have first made man with a fixed prevailing principle of sin in his heart? I answer, 1. It was meet, if sin did come into existence and appear in the world, it should arise from the imperfection which properly belongs to a creature as such, and should appear so to do, that it might appear not to be from God as the efficient or fountain. But this could not have been, if man had been made at first with sin in his heart, nor unless the abiding principle and habit of sin were first introduced by an evil act of the creature. If sin had not arisen from the imperfection of the creature, it would not have been so visible that it did not arise from God as the positive cause and real source of it. But it would require room that cannot be here allowed fully to consider all the difficulties which have been started concerning the first entrance of sin into the world. And therefore, too, I would observe that objections against the doctrine that has been laid down in opposition to the Arminian notion of liberty from these difficulties are altogether impertinent, because no additional difficulty is incurred by adhering to a scheme in this manner differing from theirs, and none would be removed or avoided by agreeing with and maintaining theirs. Nothing that the Arminians say about the contingents or self-determining power of man's will can serve to explain with less difficulty how the first sinful volition of mankind could take place, and man be justly charged with the blame of it. To say the will was self-determined or determined by free choice in that sinful volition, which is to say, that the first sinful volition was determined by a foregoing sinful volition, is no solution of the difficulty. It is an odd way of solving difficulties to advance greater in order to it. To say 2 and 2 make 9, or that a child begat his father, solves no difficulty. No more does it to say the first sinful act of choice was before the first sinful act of choice, and chose and determined it and brought it to pass. Nor is it any better solution to say the first sinful volition chose, determined, and produced itself, which is to say, it was before it was. Nor will it go any further towards helping us over the difficulty to say the first sinful volition arose accidentally, without any cause at all, any more than it will solve that difficult question, how the world could be made out of nothing. To say it came into being out of nothing, without any cause, as has been already observed. And if we should allow that the first evil volition should arise by perfect accident, without any cause, it would relieve no difficulty about God laying the blame of it to man. For how was man to blame for perfect accident, which had no cause, and which therefore he was not the cause of, any more than if it came by some external cause? Such kind of solutions are no better than if some person going about to solve some of the strange mathematical paradoxes about infinitely great and small quantities, as that some infinitely great quantities are infinitely greater than some other infinitely great quantities, and also that some infinitely small quantities are infinitely less than others, which yet are infinitely little, should say that mankind have been under a mistake in supposing a greater quantity to exceed a smaller, and that 100 multiplied by 10 makes but a single unit. End of Part 4, Section 10. Part 4, Section 11 of The Freedom of the Will by Jonathan Edwards. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Of a supposed inconsistence between these principles and God's moral character. The things which have been already observed may be sufficient to answer most of the objections and silence the great exclamations of Arminians against the Calvinists from the supposed inconsistence of Calvinistic principles with the moral perfections of God as exercised in his government of mankind. The consistence of such a doctrine of necessity as has been maintained with the fitness and reasonableness of God's commands, promises, and threatenings, rewards and punishments has been particularly considered. The cavils of our opponents, as though our doctrine of necessity made God the author of sin, have been answered, and also their objections against these principles as inconsistent with God's sincerity in his counsels, invitations, and persuasions has been already obviated in what has been observed respecting the consistence of what Calvinists suppose concerning the secret and revealed will of God. By that it appears there is no repugnance in supposing it may be the secret will of God, that his ordination and permission of events should be such that it shall be a certain consequence that a thing never will come to pass, which yet it is man's duty to do, and so God's perceptive will that he should do. And this is the same thing as to say God may sincerely command and require him to do it. And if he may be sincere in commanding him, he may for the same reason be sincere in counseling, inviting, and using persuasions with him to do it. Counsels and invitations are manifestations of God's preceptive will, or of what God loves, and what is in itself, and as man's act, agreeable to his heart, and not of his disposing will, and what he chooses as a part of his own infinite scheme of things. It has been particularly shown, Part 3, Section 4, that such a necessity as has been maintained is not inconsistent with the propriety and fitness of divine commands, and for the same reason not inconsistent with the sincerity of invitations and counsels in the corollary at the end of that section. Yea, it hath been shown, Part 3, Section 7, Corollary 1, that this objection of Arminians concerning the sincerity and use of divine exhortations, invitations, and counsels is demonstrably against themselves. Notwithstanding, I would further observe that the difficulty of reconciling the sincerity of counsels, invitations, and persuasions with such an antecedent known fixedness of all events as has been supposed is not peculiar to this scheme, as distinguished from that of the generality of Arminians which acknowledge the absolute foreknowledge of God, and therefore it would be unreasonably brought as an objection against my differing from them. The main seeming difficulty in the case is this, that God in counseling, inviting, and persuading makes a show of aiming at, seeking, and using endeavors for the thing exhorted and persuaded to, whereas it is impossible for any intelligent being truly to seek or use endeavors for a thing which he at the same time knows most perfectly will not come to pass, and that it is absurd to suppose he makes the obtaining of a thing his end in his calls and counsels, which he at the same time infallibly knows will not be obtained by these means. Now, if God knows this in the utmost certainty and perfection, the way by which he comes by this knowledge makes no difference. If he knows it is by the necessity which he sees in things, or by some other means, it alters not the case. But it is in effect allowed by Arminians themselves that God's inviting and persuading men to do things, which he at the same time certainly knows will not be done, is no evidence of insincerity, because they allow that God has a certain foreknowledge of all sinful actions and omissions, and as this is implicitly allowed by most Arminians, so all that pretend to own the Scriptures to be the Word of God must be constrained to allow it. God commanded and counseled Pharaoh to let his people go, and use arguments and persuasions to induce him to it. He laid before him arguments taken from his infinite greatness and almighty power, Exodus 7:16, and forewarned him of the fatal consequences of his refusal from time to time, chapter 8, 1-2, 20-21, 9, 1-5, 13-17, and 10:3-6. He commanded Moses and the elders of Israel to go and beseech Pharaoh to let the people go, and at the same time told them he knew surely that he would not comply with it. Exodus 3:18-19. And thou shalt come, thou and the elders of Israel, unto the king of Egypt, and you shall say unto him, The Lord God of the Hebrews hath met with us, and now let us go, we beseech thee, 3 days' journey into the wilderness, that we may sacrifice unto the Lord our God. And I am sure that the king of Egypt will not let you go. So our blessed Savior, the evening wherein he was betrayed, knew that Peter would shamefully deny him before the morning. For he declares it to him with asseverations to show the certainty of it, and tells the disciples that all of them should be offended because of him that night. Matthew 26:31-35, John 13:38, Luke 22:31-34, John 16:32. And yet it was their duty to avoid these things. They were very sinful things which God had forbidden, and which it was their duty to watch and pray against, and they were obliged to do so from the counsels and persuasions Christ used with them at that very time so to do. Matthew 26:41. Watch and pray that ye enter not into temptation, so that whatever difficulty there can be in this matter, it can be no objection against any principles which have been maintained in opposition to the principles of Arminians, nor does it any more concern me to remove the difficulty than it does them, or indeed all, that call themselves Christians and acknowledge the divine authority of the Scriptures. Nevertheless, this matter may possibly, God allowing, be more particularly and largely considered in some future discourse on the doctrine of predestination. But I would here observe that however the defenders of that notion of liberty which I have opposed exclaim against the doctrine of Calvinists as tending to bring men into doubts concerning the moral perfections of God, it is their scheme and not the scheme of Calvinists that indeed is justly chargeable with this. For it is one of their most fundamental points that a freedom of will, consisting in self-determination without all necessity, is essential to moral agency. This is the same thing as to say that such a determination of the will without all necessity must be in all intelligent beings, in those things wherein they are moral agents, or in their moral acts, and from this it will follow that God's will is not necessarily determined in anything he does as a moral agent, or in any of his acts that are of a moral nature, so that in all things wherein he acts holily, justly, and truly, he does not act necessarily, or his will is not necessarily determined to act holily and justly. Because if it were necessarily determined, he would not be a moral agent in thus acting. His will would be attended with necessity, which they say is inconsistent with moral agency. He can act no otherwise. He is at no liberty in the affair. He is determined by unavoidable, invincible necessity. Therefore, such agency is no moral agency. Yea, no agency at all, properly speaking. A necessary agent is no agent. He being passive and subject to necessity, what he does is no act of his, but an effect of a necessity prior to any act of his. This is agreeable to their manner of arguing. Now then, what has become of all our proof of the moral perfections of God? How can we prove that God certainly will, in any one instance, do that which is just and holy, seeing his will is determined in the matter by no necessity? We have no other way of proving that anything certainly will be, but only by the necessity of the event. Where we can see no necessity, but that the thing may be, or may not be, there we are unavoidably left at a loss. We have no other way properly and truly to demonstrate the moral perfections of God, but the way that Mr. Chubb proves them, page 252, 261 to 263 of his tracts, viz., that God must necessarily perfectly know what is most worthy and valuable in itself, which in the nature of things is best and fittest to be done. And as this is most eligible in itself, he being omniscient must see it to be so, and being both omniscient and self-sufficient cannot have any temptation to reject it, and so must necessarily will that which is best. And thus by this necessity of the determination of God's will to what is good and best, we demonstrably establish God's moral character. Corollary: from what has been observed, it appears that most of the arguments from Scripture which Arminians make use of to support their scheme are no other than begging the question. For in these they determine, in the first place, that without such a freedom of will as they hold, men cannot be proper moral agents, nor the subjects of command, counsel, persuasion, invitation, promises, threatenings, expostulations, rewards, and punishments, and that without such freedom it is to no purpose for men to take any care or use any diligence, endeavors, or means in order to their avoiding sin, or becoming holy, escaping punishment, or obtaining happiness. And having supposed these things, which are grand things in question in the debate, then they heap up Scriptures containing commands, counsels, calls, warnings, persuasions, expostulations, promises, and threatenings, as doubtless they may find enough such, the Bible being confessedly full of them, from the beginning to the end, and then they glory how full the Scripture is on their side, how many more texts there are that evidently favor their scheme than such as seem to favor the contrary. But let them first make manifest the things in question, which they suppose and take for granted, and show them to be consistent with themselves, and produce clear evidence of their truth, and they have gained their point, as all will confess, without bringing one Scripture. For none denies that there are commands, counsels, promises, threatenings, etc. in the Bible. But unless they do these things, their multiplying such texts of Scriptures is insignificant and vain. It may further be observed that such Scriptures as they bring are really against them, and not for them, as it has been demonstrated that it is their scheme and not ours, is inconsistent with the use of motives and persuasives, or any moral means whatsoever to induce men to the practice of virtue, or abstaining from wickedness. Their principles and not ours are repugnant to moral agency, and inconsistent with moral government, with law or precept, with the nature of virtue or vice, reward or punishment, and with everything whatsoever of a moral nature, either on the part of the moral governor, or in the state actions or conduct of the subject. End of Part 4, Section 11. Part 4, Section 12 of the Freedom of the Will, by Jonathan Edwards. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Of a supposed tendency of these principles to atheism and licentiousness. If any object against what has been maintained, that it tends to atheism, I know not on what grounds such an objection can be raised, unless it be that some atheists have held a doctrine of necessity, which they suppose to be like this. But if it be so, I am persuaded the Arminians would not look upon it just, that their notion of freedom and contingence should be charged with a tendency to all the errors that ever any embrace, to have held such opinions. The Stoic philosophers, whom the Calvinists are charged with agreeing with, were no atheists, but the greatest theists, and nearest akin to Christians in their opinions concerning the unity and the perfections of the Godhead of all the heathen philosophers. And Epicurus, that chief father of atheism, maintained no such doctrine of necessity, but was the greatest maintainer of contingence. The doctrine of necessity, which supposes a necessary connection of all events on some antecedent ground and reason of their existence, is the only medium we have to prove the being of God. And the contrary doctrine of contingents, even as maintained by Arminians, which certainly implies or infers that events may come into existence or begin to be without dependence on anything foregoing as their cause, ground, or reason, takes away all proof of the being of God, which proof is summarily expressed by the Apostle in Romans 1:20, and this is a tendency to atheism with a witness, so that indeed it is the doctrine of Arminians and not of the Calvinists that is justly charged with a tendency to atheism, it being built on a foundation that is the utter subversion of every demonstrative argument for the proof of a deity, as has been shown, Part 2, Section 3. And whereas it has often been said that the Calvinistic doctrine of necessity saps the foundations of all religion and virtue, and tends to the greatest licentiousness of practice, this objection is built on the pretense that our doctrine renders vain all means and endeavors in order to be virtuous and religious, which pretense has been already particularly considered in the 5th section of this part, where it has been demonstrated that this doctrine has no such tendency, but that such a tendency is truly to be charged on the contrary doctrine, inasmuch as the notion of contingents, which their doctrine implies in its certain consequences, overthrows all connection in every degree between endeavor and event, means and end. And besides, if many other things which have been observed to belong to the Arminian doctrine, or to be plain consequences of it, be considered, there will appear just reason to suppose that it is that which must rather tend to licentiousness. Their doctrine excuses all evil inclinations which men find to be natural, because in such inclinations they are not self-determined, as such inclinations are not owing to any choice or determination of their own wills, which leads men wholly to justify themselves in all their wicked actions, so far as natural inclination has had a hand in determining their wills to the commission of them. Yea, these notions which suppose moral necessity and inability to be inconsistent with blame or moral obligation will directly lead men to justify the vilest acts and practices from the strength of their wicked inclinations of all sorts, strong inclinations inducing a moral necessity, yea, to excuse every degree of evil inclination, so far as this has evidently prevailed and been the thing which has determined their wills, because so far as antecedent inclination determined the will, so far the will was without liberty of indifference and self-determination, which at last will come to this, that men will justify themselves in all the wickedness they commit. It has been observed already that this scheme of things exceedingly diminishes the guilt of sin and the difference between the greatest and smallest offences, and if it be pursued in its real consequences, it leaves room for no such thing as either virtue or vice, blame or praise in the world. And again, how naturally does this notion of the sovereign self-determining power of the will in all things virtuous or vicious, and whatsoever deserves either reward or punishment, tend to encourage men to put off the work of religion and virtue and turning from sin to God, since they have a sovereign power to determine themselves just when they please, or if not, they are wholly excusable in going on in sin because of their inability to do any other. If it should be said that the tendency of this doctrine of necessity to licentiousness appears by the improvement many at this day actually make of it to justify themselves in their dissolute courses, I will not deny that some men do unreasonably abuse this doctrine, as they do many other things which are true and excellent in their own nature, but I deny that this proves the doctrine itself has any tendency to licentiousness. I think the tendency of doctrines, by what now appears in the world, and in our nation in particular, may much more justly be argued from the general effect which has been seen to attend the prevailing of the principles of Arminians and the contrary principles, as both have had their turn of general prevalence in our nation, if it be indeed, as is pretended, that Calvinistic doctrines undermine the very foundation of all religion and morality, and enervate and disannul all rational motives to holy and virtuous practice, and that the contrary doctrines give the inducements to virtue and goodness their proper force, and exhibit religion in a rational light, tending to recommend it to the reason of mankind, and enforce it in a manner that is agreeable to their natural notions of things. I say, if it be thus, it is remarkable that virtue and religious practice should prevail most, when the former doctrines, so inconsistent with it, prevailed almost universally, and that ever since the latter doctrines, so happily agreeing with it, and of so proper and excellent a tendency to promote it, have been gradually prevailing, vice, profaneness, luxury, and wickedness of all sorts, and contempt of all religion, and of every kind of seriousness and strictness of conversation, should proportionably prevail, and that these things should thus accompany one another, and rise and prevail one with another, now for a whole age together. It is remarkable that this happy remedy, discovered by the free inquiries and superior sense and wisdom of this age against the pernicious effects of Calvinism, so inconsistent with religion, and tending so much to banish all virtue from the earth, should, on so long a trial, be attended with no good effect, but that the consequence should be the reverse of amendment, that in proportion as the remedy takes place and is thoroughly applied, so the disease should prevail, and the very same dismal effect take place to the highest degree, which Calvinistic doctrines are supposed to have so great a tendency to, even the banishing of religion and virtue, and the prevailing of unbounded licentiousness of manners. If these things are truly so, they are very remarkable, and matter of very curious speculation. End of Part 4, Section 12. Part 4, Section 13 of The Freedom of the Will by Jonathan Edwards. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Concerning that objection against the reasoning by which the Calvinistic doctrine is supposed that it is metaphysical and abstruse. It has often been objected against the defenders of Calvinistic principles that in their reasonings they run into nice scholastic distinctions and abstruse metaphysical subtleties, and set these in opposition to common sense. And it is possible that after the former manner it may be alleged against the reasoning by which I have endeavored to confute the Arminian scheme of liberty and moral agency, that it is very abstracted and metaphysical. Concerning this, I would observe the following things. 1. If that be made an objection against the foregoing reasoning, that it is metaphysical, or may properly be reduced to the science of metaphysics, it is a very impertinent objection. Whether it be so or no, is not worthy of any dispute or controversy. If the reasoning be good, it is as frivolous to inquire what science it is properly reduced to, as what language it is delivered in. And for a man to go about to confute the arguments of his opponent by telling him his arguments are metaphysical would be as weak as to tell him his arguments could not be substantial because they were written in French or Latin. The question is not whether what is said be metaphysics, physics, logic, or mathematics, Latin, French, English, or Mohawk, but whether the reasoning be good and the arguments truly conclusive. The foregoing arguments are no more metaphysical than those which we use against the Papists to disprove their doctrine of transubstantiation, alleging it is inconsistent with the notion of corporeal identity, that it should be in 10,000 places at the same time. It is by metaphysical arguments only we are able to prove that the rational soul is not corporeal, that lead or sand cannot think, that thoughts are not square around or do not weigh a pound. The arguments by which we prove the being of God, if handled closely and distinctly, so as to show their clear and demonstrative evidence, must be metaphysically treated. It is by metaphysics only that we can demonstrate that God is not limited to a place, or is not mutable, that he is not ignorant or forgetful, that it is impossible for him to lie, to be unjust, and that there is one God only, and not hundreds or thousands. And indeed we have no strict demonstration of anything excepting mathematical truths, but by metaphysics. We can have no proof that is properly demonstrative of any one proposition relating to the being and nature of God, his creation of the world, the dependence of all things on him, the nature of bodies or spirits, the nature of our own souls, or any of the great truths of morality and natural religion, but what is metaphysical. I am willing my arguments should be brought to the test of the strictest and justest reason, and that a clear, distinct, and determinate meaning of the terms I use should be insisted on, but let not the whole be rejected, as if all were confuted, by fixing on it the epithet metaphysical. 2. If the reasoning which has been made use of be in some sense metaphysical, it will not follow that therefore it must need be abstruse, unintelligible, and akin to the jargon of the schools. I humbly conceive the foregoing reasoning, at least to those things which are most material belonging to it, depends on no abstruse definitions or distinctions, or terms without a meaning, or of very ambiguous and undetermined signification, or any points of such abstraction and subtlety as tends to involve the attentive understanding in clouds and darkness. There is no high degree of refinement and abstruse speculation in determining that a thing is not before it is, and so cannot be the cause of itself, or that the first act of free choice has not another act of free choice going before that, to excite or direct it, or in determining that no choice is made while the mind remains in a state of absolute indifference, that preference and equilibrium never coexist, and that therefore no choice is made in a state of liberty consisting in indifference, and that so far as the will is determined by motives exhibiting and operating previous to the act of the will, so far it is not determined by the act of the will itself, then nothing can begin to be which before was not, without a cause, or some antecedent ground or reason why it then begins to be, that effects depend on their causes and are connected with them, that virtue is not the worse, nor sin the better, for the strength of inclination with which it is practised, and the difficulty which thence arises of doing otherwise, that when it is already infallibly known that the thing will be, it is not contingent whether it will ever be or no, or that it can be truly said, notwithstanding that it is not necessary it should be, but it either may be or may not be, and the like might be observed of many other things which belong to the foregoing reasoning. If any shall still stand to it that the foregoing reasoning is nothing but mere metaphysical sophistry, and that it must be so, that the seeming force of their arguments all depends on some fallacy, and while that is hid in the obscurity which always attends a great degree of metaphysical abstraction and refinement, and shall be ready to say, here is indeed something tends to confound the mind, but not to satisfy it, for who can ever be truly satisfied in it, that men are fitly blamed or commended, punished or rewarded for those volitions which are not from themselves, and of whose existence they are not the causes. Men may refine as much as they please and advance the abstract notions, and make out 1,000 seeming contradictions to puzzle our understandings, yet there can be no satisfaction in such doctrine as this. The natural sense of the mind of man will always resist it. I humbly conceive that such an objector, if he has capacity and humility and calmness of spirit sufficient, impartially and thoroughly to examine himself, will find that he knows not really what he would be at, and indeed his difficulty is nothing but a mere prejudice from an inadvertent customary use of words in a meaning that is not clearly understood nor carefully reflected upon. Let the objector reflect again, if he has candor and patience enough, and does not scorn to be at the trouble of close attention in the affair. He would have a man's volition be from himself. Let it be from himself, most primarily and originally of any way conceivable, that is, from its own choice. How will that help the matter as to his being justly blamed or praised, unless that choice itself be blameworthy or praiseworthy? And how is the choice itself, an ill choice, for instance, blameworthy, according to these principles, unless that be from himself too, in the same manner, that is, from his own choice? But the original and first determining choice in the affair is not from his choice. His choice is not the cause of it, and if it be from himself some other way, and not from his choice, surely that will not help the matter. If it be not from himself of choice, then it is not from himself voluntarily, and if so, he is surely no more to blame than if it were not from himself at all. It is vanity to pretend. It is a sufficient answer to this to say that it is nothing but metaphysical refinement and subtlety, and so attended with obscurity and uncertainty. If it be the natural sense of our minds that what is blameworthy in a man must be from himself, then it doubtless is also that it must be from something bad in himself, a bad choice or bad disposition. But then our natural sense is that this bad choice or disposition is evil in itself, and the man blameworthy for it on its own account, without taking into our notion of its blameworthiness another bad choice or disposition going before this, from whence this arises. For that is a ridiculous absurdity, running us into an immediate contradiction which our natural sense of blameworthiness has nothing to do with, and never comes into the mind, nor is supposed in the judgment we naturally make of the affair. As was demonstrated before, natural sense does not place the moral evil of volitions and dispositions in the cause of them, but the nature of them. An evil thing being from a man, or from something antecedent in him, is not essential to the original notion we have of blameworthiness, but it is its being the choice of the heart, as appears by this, that if a thing be from us, and not from our choice, it has not the nature of blameworthiness, or ill desert, according to our natural sense. When a thing is from a man, in that sense that it is from his will or choice, he is to blame for it, because his will is in it. So far as the will is in it, blame is in it, and no further. Neither do we go any further in our notion of blame, to inquire whether the bad will be from a bad will. There is no consideration of the original of that bad will, because according to our natural apprehension, blame originally consists in it. Therefore a thing being from a man is a secondary consideration in the notion of blame or ill desert. Because those things in our external actions are most properly said to be from us, which are from our choice, and no other external actions but those that are from us in this sense have the nature of blame, and they indeed not so properly because they are from us, as because we are in them, that is, our wills are in them, not so much because they are from some property of ours, as because they are our properties. However, all these external actions being truly from us as their cause, and we being so used in ordinary speech and in the common affairs of life to speak of men's actions and conduct which we see and which affect human society as deserving ill or well, as worthy of blame or praise, hence it is come to pass that philosophers have incautiously taken all their measures of good and evil, praise and blame, from the dictates of common sense about these overt acts of men, to the running of every thing into the most lamentable and dreadful confusion. And therefore I observe, 3. It is so far from being true, whatever may be pretended, that the proof of the doctrine which has been maintained depends on certain abstruse, unintelligible metaphysical terms and notions, and that the Arminian scheme, without needing such clouds and darkness for its defence, is supported by the plain dictates of common sense, that the very reverse is most certainly true, and that to a great degree. It is fact that they, and not we, have confounded things with metaphysical, unintelligible notions and phrases, and have drawn them from the light of plain truth into the gross darkness of abstruse metaphysical propositions, and words without a meaning. Their pretended demonstrations depend very much on such unintelligible metaphysical phrases as self-determination and sovereignty of the will, and the metaphysical sense they put on such terms as necessity, contingency, action, agency, etc., quite diverse from their meaning as used in common speech, and which, as they use them, are without any consistent meaning, or any manner of distinct consistent ideas, as far from it as any of the abstruse terms and perplexed phrases of the peripatetic philosophers, or the most unintelligible jargon of the schools, or the cant of the wildest fanatics. Yea, we may be bold to say these metaphysical terms, on which they build so much, are what they use without knowing what they mean themselves. They are pure metaphysical sounds, without any ideas whatsoever in the minds to answer them, inasmuch as it has been demonstrated that there cannot be any notion in the mind consistent with these expressions as they pretend to explain them, because their explanations destroy themselves. No such notions as imply self-contradiction and self-abolition, and this is a great many ways can subsist in the mind, as there can be no idea of a whole which is less than any of its parts, or of solid extension without dimensions, or of an effect which is before its cause. Arminians improve these terms as terms of art, and in their metaphysical meaning to advance and establish those things which are contrary to common sense in a high degree. Thus, instead of the plain vulgar notion of liberty, which all mankind in every part of the face of the earth and in all ages have, consisting in an opportunity to do as one pleases, they have introduced a new strange liberty, consisting in indifference, contingence, and self-determination, by which they involve themselves and others in great obscurity and manifold gross inconsistence. So instead of placing virtue and vice, as common sense places them very much, in fixed bias and inclination, and greater virtue and vice and stronger and more established inclination, these, through their refinings and abstruse notions, suppose a liberty consisting in indifference to be essential to all virtue and vice. So they have reasoned themselves, not by metaphysical distinctions, but metaphysical confusion, into many principles about moral agency, blame, praise, reward, and punishment, which are, as has been shown, exceeding contrary to the common sense of mankind, and perhaps to their own sense which governs them in common life. End of Part 4, Section 13. Part 4, Section 14 of the Freedom of the Will by Jonathan Edwards. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Conclusion. Whether the things which have been alleged are liable to any tolerable answer in the way of calm, intelligible, and strict reasoning, I must leave others to judge. But I am sensible they are liable to one sort of answer. It is not unlikely that some who value themselves on the supposed rational and generous principles of the modern fashionable divinity will have their indignation and disdain raised at the sight of this discourse, and on perceiving what things are pretended to be proved in it. And if they think it worthy of being read, or of so much notice as to say much about it, they may probably renew the usual exclamations with additional vehemence and contempt about the fate of the heathen, Hobbes's necessity, and making men mere machines, accumulating the terrible epithets of fatal, unfrustrable, inevitable, irresistible, etc., and it may be with addition of horrid and blasphemous, and perhaps much skill may be used to set forth things which have been said in colors which shall be shocking to the imaginations and moving to the passions of those who have either too little capacity or too much confidence of the opinions they have imbibed, and contempt of the contrary, to try the matter by any serious and circumspect examination. Or difficulties may be stated and insisted on, which do not belong to the controversy, because, let them be more or less real and hard to be resolved, they are not what are owing to anything distinguishing of this scheme from that of the Arminians, and would not be removed nor diminished by renouncing the former and adhering to the latter. Or some particular things may be picked out, which they may think will sound harshest in the ears of the generality, and these may be glossed and descanted on with tart and contemptuous words, and from thence the whole discourse may be treated with triumph and insult. It is easy to see how the decision of most of the points in controversy between Calvinists and Arminians depends on the determination of this grand article concerning the freedom of the will requisite to moral agency, and that by clearing and established in the Calvinistic doctrine in this point, the chief arguments are obviated by which Arminian doctrines in general are supported, and the contrary doctrines demonstratively confirmed. Hereby it becomes manifest that God's moral government over mankind is treating them as moral agents, making them the objects of his commands, counsels, calls, warnings, expostulations, promises, threatenings, rewards, and punishments, is not inconsistent with a determining disposal of all events of every kind throughout the universe in his providence, either by positive efficiency or permission. Indeed, such an universal determining providence infers some kind of necessity of all events, such a necessity as implies an infallible previous fixedness of the futurity of the event, but no other necessity of moral events or volitions of intelligent agents is needful in order to this than moral necessity, which does as much ascertain the futurity of the event as any other necessity. But as has been demonstrated, such a necessity is not at all repugnant to moral agency, and a reasonable use of commands, calls, rewards, punishments, etc. Yea, not only are objections of this kind against the doctrine of an universal determining providence removed by what has been said, but the truth of such a doctrine is demonstrated, as it has been demonstrated that the futurity of all future events is established by previous necessity, either natural or moral. So it is manifest that the sovereign creator and disposer of the world has ordered this necessity by ordering his own conduct, either in designedly acting or forbearing to act. For as the being of the world is from God, so the circumstances in which it had its being at first, both negative and positive, must be ordered by him in one of these ways, and all the necessary consequences of these circumstances must be ordered by him. And God's active and positive interpositions after the world was created, and the consequences of these interpositions, also every instance of his forbearing to interpose, and the sure consequences of this forbearance must all be determined according to his pleasure. And therefore every event which is the consequence of anything whatsoever, or that is connected with any foregoing thing or circumstances, either positive or negative, as the ground or reason of its existence, must be ordered of God, either by a designing efficiency and interposition, or a designed forbearance to operate or interpose. But as has been proved, all events whatsoever are necessarily connected with something foregoing, either positive or negative, which is the ground of its existence. It follows, therefore, that the whole series of events is thus connected with something in the state of things, either positive or negative, which is original in the series, that is, something which is connected with nothing preceding that, but God's own immediate conduct, either his acting or forbearing to act. From whence it follows that as God designedly orders his own conduct and its connected consequences, it must necessarily be that he designedly orders all things. The things which have been said obviate some of the chief objections of Arminians against the Calvinistic doctrine of the total depravity and corruption of man's nature, whereby his heart is wholly under the power of sin, and he is utterly unable without the interposition of sovereign grace savingly to love God, believe in Christ, or do anything that is truly good and acceptable in God's sight. For the main objection against this doctrine, that it is inconsistent with the freedom of man's will, consisting in indifference and self-determining power, because it supposes man to be under a necessity of sinning, and that God requires things of him in order to his avoiding eternal damnation, which he is unable to do, and that this doctrine is wholly inconsistent with the sincerity of counsels, invitations, etc. Now this doctrine supposes no other necessity of sinning than a moral necessity, which, as has been shown, does not at all excuse sin, and supposes no other inability to obey any command or perform any duty, even the most spiritual and exalted, but a moral inability, which, as has been proved, does not excuse persons in the non-performance of any good thing, or make them not to be the proper objects of commands, counsels, and invitations. And moreover, it has been shown that there is not, and never can be, either in existence or so much as in idea, any such freedom of will consisting in indifference and self-determination, for the sake of which this doctrine of original sin is cast out, and that no such freedom is necessary in order to the nature of sin, and a just desert of punishment. The things which have been observed do also take off the main objections of Arminians against the doctrine of efficacious grace, and at the same time prove the grace of God in a sinner's conversion, if there be any grace or divine influence in the affair, to be efficacious, yea, and irresistible too, if by irresistible is meant that which is attended with a moral necessity, which it is impossible should ever be violated by any resistance. The main objection of Arminians against this doctrine is that it is inconsistent with their self-determining freedom of will, and that it is repugnant to the nature of virtue that it should be wrought in the heart by the determining efficacy and power of another, instead of its being owing to a self-moving power, that in that case the good which is wrought would not be our virtue, but rather God's virtue, because not the person in whom it is wrought is the determining author of it, but God that wrought it in him. But the things which are the foundation of these objections have been considered, and it has been demonstrated that the liberty of moral agents does not consist in self-determining power, and that there is no need of any such liberty in order to the nature of virtue, nor does it at all hinder, but that the state or act of the will may be the virtue of the subject, though it be not from self-determination, but the determination of an intrinsic cause, even so as to cause the event to be morally necessary to the subject of it. And as it has been proved that nothing in the state or acts of the will of man is contingent, but that on the contrary every event of this kind is necessary by a moral necessity, and has also been now demonstrated that the doctrine of an universal determining providence follows from that doctrine of necessity which was proved before, and so that God does decisively in his providence order all the volitions of moral agents, either by positive influence or permission, and it being allowed on all hands that what God does in the affair of man's virtuous volitions, whether it be more or less, is by some positive influence, not by mere permission, as in the affair of a sinful volition. If we put these things together, it will follow that God's assistance or influence must be determining and decisive, or must be attended with a moral necessity of the event, and so that God gives virtue, holiness, and conversion to sinners by an influence which determines the effect in such a manner that the effect will infallibly follow by a moral necessity, which is what Calvinists mean by efficacious and irresistible grace. The things which have been said do likewise answer the chief objections against the doctrine of God's universal and absolute decree, and afford infallible proof of this doctrine, and of the doctrine of absolute, eternal, personal election in particular. The main objections against these doctrines are, that they infer a necessity of the volitions of moral agents, and of the future moral state and acts of men, and so are not consistent with those eternal rewards and punishments which are connected with conversion and impenitence, nor can be made to agree with the reasonableness and sincerity of the precepts, calls, counsels, warnings, and expostulations of the Word of God, or with the various methods and means of grace which God uses with sinners to bring them to repentance, and the whole of that moral government which God exercises towards mankind, and that they infer an inconsistence between the secret and revealed will of God, and make God the author of sin. But all these things have been obviated in the preceding discourse, and the certain truth of these doctrines concerning God's eternal purposes will follow from what was just now observed concerning God's universal providence, how it infallibly follows from what has been proved, that God orders all events, and the volitions of moral agents, amongst others, by such a decisive disposal that the events are infallibly connected with his disposal. For if God disposes all events so that the infallible existence of the events is decided by his providence, then doubtless he thus orders and decides all things knowingly and on design. God does not do what he does, nor order what he orders accidentally and unawares, either without or beside his intention. And if there be a foregoing design of doing and ordering as he does, this is the same with a purpose or decree. And as it has been shown that nothing is new to God in any respect, but all things are perfectly and equally in his view from eternity, hence it will follow that his designs or purposes are not things formed anew, founded on any new views or appearances, but are all eternal purposes. And as it has been now shown how the doctrine of determining efficacious grace certainly follows from things proved in the foregoing discourse, hence will necessarily follow the doctrine of particular, eternal, absolute election. For if men are made true saints no otherwise than as God makes them so, and distinguishes them from others by his efficacious power and influence, that decides and fixes the event, and God thus makes some saints and not others, on design or purpose, and, as has been now observed, no designs of God are new, it follows that God thus distinguished from others all that ever become true saints by his eternal design or decree. I might also show how God's certain foreknowledge must suppose an absolute decree, and how such a decree can be proved to a demonstration from it, but that this discourse may not be lengthened out too much, that must be omitted for the present. From these things it will inevitably follow that however Christ in some sense may be said to die for all, and to redeem all visible Christians, yea, the whole world, by his death, yet there must be something particular in the design of his death with respect to such as he intended should actually be saved thereby. As appears by what has been now shown, God has the actual salvation or redemption of a certain number in his proper absolute design, and of a certain number only, and therefore such a design only can be prosecuted in anything God does in order to the salvation of men. God pursues a proper design of the salvation of the elect in giving Christ to die, and prosecutes such a design with respect to no other, most strictly speaking, for it is impossible that God should prosecute any other design than only such as he has. He certainly does not, in the highest propriety and strictness of speech, pursue a design that he has not. And indeed, such a particularity and limitation of redemption will as infallibly follow from the doctrine of God's foreknowledge as from that of the decree. For it is as impossible in strictness of speech that God should prosecute a design or aim at a thing which he at the same time most perfectly knows will not be accomplished, as that he should use endeavors for that which is beside his decree. By the things which have been proved are obviated some of the main objections against the doctrine of the infallible and necessary perseverance of saints, and some of the main foundations of this doctrine are established. The main prejudices of Arminians against this doctrine seem to be these. They suppose such a necessary, infallible perseverance to be repugnant to the freedom of the will, that it must be owing to man's own self-determining power. He first becomes virtuous and holy, and so in like manner it must be left a thing contingent, to be determined by the same freedom of will, whether he will persevere in virtue and holiness, and that otherwise his continuing steadfast in faith and obedience would not be his virtue, or at all praiseworthy and rewardable, nor could his perseverance be properly the matter of divine commands, counsels, and promises, nor his apostasy be properly threatened, and men warned against it. Whereas we find all these things in Scripture, there we find steadfastness and perseverance in true Christianity, represented as the virtue of the saints, spoken of as praiseworthy in them, and glorious rewards promised to it, and also find that God makes it the subject of his commands, counsels, and promises, and the contrary of threatenings and warnings. But the foundation of these objections has been removed by showing that moral necessity and infallible certainty of events is not inconsistent with these things, and that as to freedom of will, lying in the power of the will to determine itself, there neither is any such thing, nor is there any need of it, in order to virtue, reward, commands, counsels, etc. And as the doctrines of efficacious grace and absolute election do certainly follow from the things proved in the preceding discourse, so some of the main foundations of the doctrine of perseverance are thereby established. If the beginning of true faith and holiness, and a man becoming a true saint at first, does not depend on the self-determining power of the will, but on the determining efficacious grace of God, it may well be argued that it is also with respect to men being continued saints, or persevering in faith and holiness. The conversion of a sinner being not owing to a man's self-determination, but to God's determination and eternal election, which is absolute and depending on the sovereign will of God, and not on the free will of man, as is evident from what has been said, it being very evident from the Scriptures that the eternal election of saints to faith and holiness is also an election of them to eternal salvation. Hence their appointment to salvation must also be absolute, and not depending on their contingent, self-determining will. From all which it follows that it is absolutely fixed in God's decree that all true saints shall persevere to actual eternal salvation. But I must leave all these things to the consideration of the impartial reader, and when he has maturely weighed them, I would propose it to his consideration whether many of the first reformers, and others that succeeded them, whom God in their day made the chief pillars of his church, and the greatest instruments of their deliverance from error and darkness, and of the support of the cause of piety among them, have not been injured in the contempt with which they have been treated by many late writers for their teaching and maintaining such doctrines as are commonly called Calvinistic. Indeed, some of these new writers, at the same time that they have represented the doctrines of these ancient and eminent divines, as in the highest degree ridiculous and contrary to common sense, in an ostentation of a very generous charity, have allowed that they were honest, well-meaning men. Yea, it may be some of them, as though it were in great condescension and compassion to them, have allowed that they did pretty well for the day in which they lived, and considering the great disadvantages they labored under, when at the same time their manner of speaking has naturally and plainly suggested to the minds of their readers that they were persons who, through the lowness of their genius and the greatness of the bigotry with which their minds were shackled and their thoughts confined, living in the gloomy caves of superstition, fondly embraced and demurely and zealously taught the most absurd, silly, and monstrous opinions, worthy of the greatest contempt of gentlemen possessed of that noble and generous freedom of thought which happily prevails in this age of light and inquiry. When indeed such is the case that we might, if so disposed, speak as big words as they, and on far better grounds, and really all the Arminians on earth might be challenged without arrogance or vanity to make these principles of theirs, wherein they mainly differ from their fathers, whom they so much despise, consistent with common sense, yea, and perhaps to produce any doctrine ever embraced by the blindest bigot of the Church of Rome, or the most ignorant Mussulman or extravagant enthusiast, that might be reduced to more demonstrable inconsistencies and repugnances to common sense and to themselves, though their inconsistencies indeed may not lie so deep, or be so artfully veiled by a deceitful ambiguity of words and an indeterminate signification of phrases. I will not deny that these gentlemen, many of them, are men of great abilities, and have been helped to higher attainments in philosophy than those ancient divines, and have done great service to the Church of God in some respects. But I humbly conceive that their differing from their fathers with such magisterial assurance in these points in divinity must be owing to some other cause than superior wisdom. It may also be worthy of consideration whether the great alteration which has been made in the state of things in our nation and some other parts of the Protestant world in this and the past age, by exploding so generally Calvinistic doctrines, An alteration so often spoken of as worthy to be greatly rejoiced in by the friends of truth, learning, and virtue, as an instance of the great increase of light in the Christian Church, be indeed a happy change owing to any such cause as an increase of true knowledge and understanding in the things of religion, or whether there is not reason to fear that it may be owing to some worse cause. And I desire it may be considered whether the boldness of some writers may not deserve to be reflected on, who have not scrupled to say that if these and those things are true, which yet appear to be the demonstrable dictates of reason, as well as the certain dictates of the mouth of the Most High, then God is unjust and cruel and guilty of manifest deceit and double dealing and the like. Yea, some have gone so far as confidently to assert that if any book which pretends to be Scripture teaches such doctrines, that alone is sufficient warrant for mankind to reject it, as what cannot be the word of God. Some who have not gone so far have said that if the Scripture seems to teach any such doctrines so contrary to reason, we are obliged to find out some other interpretation of those texts where such doctrines seem to be exhibited. Others express themselves yet more modestly. They express a tenderness and religious fear lest they should receive and teach anything that should seem to reflect on God's moral character, or be a disparagement to his methods of administration and his moral government, and therefore express themselves as not daring to embrace some doctrines, though they seem to be delivered in Scripture according to the more obvious and natural construction of the words. But indeed it would show a truer modesty and humility if they would more entirely rely on God's wisdom and discernment, who knows infinitely better than we what is agreeable to his own perfections, and never intended to leave these matters to the decision of the wisdom and discernment of men, but by his own unerring instruction to determine for us what the truth is, knowing how little our judgment is to be depended on, and how extremely prone, vain, and blind men are to err in such matters. The truth of the case is, that if the Scripture plainly taught the opposite doctrines to those that are so much stumbled at, viz., the Arminian doctrine of free will, and others depending thereon, it would be the greatest of all difficulties that attend the Scriptures incomparably greater than its containing any, even the most mysterious, of those doctrines of the first Reformers, which our late freethinkers have so superciliously exploded. Indeed, it is a glorious argument of the divinity of the Holy Scriptures that they teach such doctrines, which in one age and another, through the blindness of men's minds and strong prejudices of their hearts, are rejected as most absurd and unreasonable by the wise and great men of the world, which yet, when they are most carefully and strictly examined, appear to be exactly agreeable to the most demonstrable, certain, and natural dictates of reason. By such things it appears that the foolishness of God is wiser than men. 1 Corinthians 1:19-20. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, I will bring to nothing the understanding of the prudent. Where is the wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the disputer of this world? Hath not God made foolish the wisdom of this world? And as it was in time past, so probably it will be in time to come, as it is also written, verses 27-29. But God hath chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the wise, and God hath chosen the weak things of the world to confound the things that are mighty. And base things of the world and things which are despised hath God chosen, yea, and things which are not, to bring to naught things that are, that no flesh should glory in his presence. Amen. End of Part 4, Section 14. Part 4, Section 15 of The Freedom of the Will by Jonathan Edwards. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Appendix, Section 15, containing remarks on the essays on the principles of morality and natural religion in a letter to a minister of the Church of Scotland. Reverend Sir, the intimations you have given me of the use which has by some been made of what I have written on the freedom of the will, etc., to vindicate what is said on the subject of liberty and necessity by the author of the essays on the principles of morality and natural religion, has occasioned my reading this author's essay on that subject with particular care and attention, and I think it must be evident to every one that has read both his essay and my inquiry that our schemes are exceedingly different from each other. The wide difference appears particularly in the following things. This author supposes that such a necessity takes place with respect to all men's actions as is inconsistent with liberty, and plainly denies that men have any liberty in acting. Thus, page 168, after he had been speaking of the necessity of our determinations as connected with motives, he concludes with saying, in short, if motives are not under our power or direction, which is confessedly the fact, we can at bottom have no liberty. Whereas I have abundantly expressed it as my mind that man in his moral actions has true liberty, and that the moral necessity which universally takes place is not in the least inconsistent with anything that is properly called liberty, and with the utmost liberty that can be desired, or that can possibly exist or be conceived of. I find that some are apt to think that in that kind of moral necessity of men's volitions, which I suppose to be universal, at least some degree of liberty denied; that though it be true I allow a sort of liberty, yet those who maintain a self-determining power in the will, and a liberty of contingence and indifference, hold a higher sort of freedom than I do. But I think this is certainly a great mistake. Liberty, as I have explained it, is the power, opportunity, or advantage that anyone has to do as he pleases, or conducting himself in any respect according to his pleasure, without considering how his pleasure comes to be as it is. It is demonstrable, and I think has been demonstrated, that no necessity of men's volitions that I maintain is inconsistent with this liberty, and I think it is impossible for any one to rise higher in his conceptions of liberty than this. If any imagine they desire, and that they conceive of, a higher and greater liberty than this, they are deceived, and delude themselves with confused ambiguous words instead of ideas. If any one should here say, yes, I conceive of a freedom above and beyond the liberty a man has of conducting himself in any respect as he pleases, viz. a liberty of choosing as he pleases, such an one, if he reflected, would either blush or laugh at his own proposal, for is not choosing as he pleases, conducting himself in some respect according to his pleasure, and still without determining how he came by that pleasure? If he says, yes, I came by that pleasure by my own choice, if he be a man of common sense, by this time he will see his own absurdity, for he must needs see that his notional conception even of this liberty does not contain any judgment or conception how he comes by that choice, which first determines his pleasure, or which originally fixed his own will respecting the affair. Or if any shall say that a man exercises liberty in this, even in determining his own choice, but not as he pleases, or not in consequence of any choice, preference, or inclination of his own, but by a determination arising contingently out of a state of absolute indifference, this is not rising higher in his conception of liberty, as such a determination of the will would not be a voluntary determination of it. Surely he that places liberty in a power of doing something not according to his own choice, or from his choice, has not a higher notion of it than he that places it in doing as he pleases, or acting from his own election. If there were a power in the mind to determine itself, but not by its choice or according to its pleasure, what advantage would it give, and what liberty worth contending for would be exercised in it? Therefore no Arminian, Pelagian, or Epicurean can rise higher in his conceptions of liberty than the notion of it which I have explained, which notion is perfectly consistent with the whole of that necessity of men's actions which I suppose takes place. And I scruple not to say it is beyond all their wits to invent a higher notion or form a higher imagination of liberty. Let them talk of sovereignty of the will, self-determining power, self-motion, self-direction, arbitrary decision, liberty, and ultraneous power of choosing differently in given cases, etc., etc., as long as they will. It is apparent that these men, in their strenuous dispute about these things, aim at they know not what, fighting for something they have no conception of, substituting a number of confused, unmeaning words instead of things and instead of thoughts. They may be challenged clearly to explain what they would have, but they never can answer the challenge. The author of the Essays, through his whole essay on liberty and necessity, goes on the supposition that in order to the being of real liberty, a man must have a freedom that is opposed to moral necessity, and yet he supposes, page 175, that such a liberty must signify a power in the mind of acting without and against motives, a power of acting without any view, purpose, or design, and even of acting in contradiction to our own desires and aversions, and to all our principles of action, and is an absurdity altogether inconsistent with a rational nature. Now whoever imagines such a liberty as this, a higher sort or degree of freedom than a liberty of following one's own views and purposes, and acting agreeably to his own inclinations and passions, who will ever reasonably suppose that a liberty which is an absurdity altogether inconsistent with a rational nature is above that which is consistent with the nature of a rational, intelligent, designing agent? The author of the essay seems to suppose such a necessity to take place as is inconsistent with some supposable power of arbitrary choice, or that there is some liberty conceivable whereby men's own actions might be more properly in their power, and by which events might be more dependent on ourselves? Contrary to what I suppose to be evident in my inquiry, what way can be imagined of our actions being more in our power from ourselves, or dependent on ourselves, than their being from our power to fulfill our own choice, to act from our own inclination, pursue our own views, and execute our own designs? Certainly to be able to act thus is as properly having our actions in our power, and dependent on ourselves, as a being liable to be the subject of acts and events contingently and fortuitously, without desire, view, purpose, or design, or any principle of action within ourselves, as we must be according to this author's own declared sense, if our actions are performed with that liberty that is opposed to moral necessity. This author seems everywhere to suppose that necessity, most properly so called, attends all men's actions, and that the terms necessary, unavoidable, impossible, etc., are equally applicable to the case of moral and natural necessity. In page 173 he says the idea of necessary and unavoidable equally agrees both to moral and physical necessity. And in page 184 all things that fall out in the natural and moral world are alike necessary. Page 174 this inclination and choice is unavoidable, caused or occasioned by the prevailing motive. In this lies the necessity of our actions, that in such circumstances it was impossible we could act otherwise. He often expresses himself in like manner elsewhere, speaking in strong terms of men's actions as unavoidable, what they cannot forbear, having no power over their own actions, the order of them being unalterably fixed and inseparably linked together, etc. On the contrary, I have largely declared that the connection between antecedent things and consequent ones, which takes place with regard to the acts of men's wills, which is called moral necessity, is called by the name of necessity improperly, and that all such terms as must, cannot, impossible, unable, irresistible, unavoidable, invincible, etc., when applied here, are not applied in their proper signification, and are either used nonsensically and with perfect insignificance, or in a sense quite diverse from their original and proper meaning, and their use in common speech, and that such a necessity as attends the acts of men's will is more properly called certainty than necessity, it being no other than the certain connection between the subject and predicate of the proposition which affirms their existence. Agreeably to what is observed in my inquiry, I think it is evidently owing to a strong prejudice arising from an insensible habitual perversion and misapplication of such like terms as necessary, impossible, unable, unavoidable, invincible, etc., that they are ready to think that to suppose a certain connection of men's volitions without any foregoing motives or inclinations or any preceding moral influence whatsoever is truly and properly to suppose a strong irrefragable chain of causes and effects as stand in the way and makes utterly vain apposite desires and endeavors like immovable and impenetrable mountains of brass, and impedes our liberty like walls of adamant, gates of brass and bars of iron, whereas all such representations suggest ideas as far from the truth as the east is from the west. Nothing that I maintain supposes that men are at all hindered by any fatal necessity from doing, and even willing and choosing as they please with full freedom, yea, with the highest degree of liberty that ever was thought of, or that ever could possibly enter into the heart of any man to conceive. I know it is in vain to endeavor to make some persons believe this, or at least fully and steadily to believe it, for it be demonstrated to them still the old prejudice remains, which has been long fixed by the use of the terms necessary, must, cannot, impossible, etc. The association with these terms of certain ideas inconsistent with liberty is not broken, and the judgment is powerfully warped by it, as a thing that has been long bent and grown stiff, if it be straightened, will return to its former curvity again and again. The author of the essays most manifestly supposes that if men had the truth concerning the real necessity of all their actions clearly in view, they would not appear to themselves or one another as at all praiseworthy or culpable, or under any moral obligation or accountable for their actions, which supposes that men are not to be blamed or praised for any of their actions, and are not under any obligations, nor are truly accountable for anything they do by reason of this necessity, which is very contrary to what I have endeavored to prove throughout the third part of my inquiry. I humbly conceive it is there shown that this is so far from the truth that the moral necessity of men's actions, which truly take place, is requisite to the being of virtue and vice, or anything praiseworthy or culpable, that the liberty of indifference and contingent, which is advanced in opposition to that necessity, is inconsistent with the being of these, as it would suppose that men are not determined in what they do by any virtuous or vicious principles, nor act from any motives, intentions, or aims whatsoever, or have any end, either good or bad, in acting. And is it not remarkable that this author should suppose that in order to men's actions truly having any desert, They must be performed without any view, purpose, design, or desire, or any principle of action, or anything agreeable to a rational nature, as it will appear that he does if we compare pages 206-207 with page 175. The author of the essay supposes that God has deeply implanted in man's nature a strong and invincible apprehension or feeling, as he calls it, of a liberty and contingence of his own actions, opposite to that necessity which truly attends them, and which in truth does not agree with real fact, is not agreeable to strict philosophic truth, is contradictory to the truth of things, and which truth contradicts, not tallying with the real plan, and that therefore such feelings are deceitful and are in reality of the delusive kind. He speaks of them as a wise delusion, as nice artificial feelings, merely that conscience may have a commanding power, meaning plainly that these feelings are a cunning artifice of the author of nature, to make men believe they are free when they are not. He supposes that by these feelings the moral world has a disguised appearance, etc. He supposes that all self-approbation and all remorse of conscience, all commendation or condemnation of ourselves or others, all sense of desert, and all that is connected with this way of thinking, all the ideas which at present are suggested by the words ought, should, arise from this delusion, and would entirely vanish without it. All which is very contrary to what I have abundantly insisted on and endeavored to demonstrate in my inquiry, and where I have largely shown that it is agreeable to the natural sense of mankind, that the moral necessity or certainty that attends men's actions is consistent with praise and blame, reward and punishment, and that it is agreeable to our natural notions that moral evil, with its desert of dislike and abhorrence, and all its other ill deservings, consists in a certain deformity in the nature of the dispositions and acts of the heart, and not in the evil of something else diverse from these supposed to be their cause or occasion. I might well ask here, whether any one is to be found in the world of mankind who is conscious to a sense or feeling, naturally and deeply rooted in his mind, that in order to a man's performing any action that is praiseworthy or blameworthy, he must exercise a liberty that implies and signifies a power of acting without any motive, view, design, desire, or principle of action. For such a liberty this author supposes that must be which is opposed to moral necessity, as I have already observed. Supposing a man should actually do good independent of desire, aim, inducement, principle, or end, is it a dictate of invincible natural sense that his act is more meritorious or praiseworthy than if he had performed it for some good end, and had been governed in it by good principles and motives? And so I might ask on the contrary with respect to evil actions. The author of the essay supposes that the liberty without necessity of which we have a natural feeling implies contingence, and speaking of this contingence, he sometimes calls it by the name of chance, and it is evident that his notion of it, or rather what he says about it, implies things happening loosely, fortuitously, by accident, and without a cause. Now I conceive the slightest reflection may be sufficient to satisfy anyone that such a contingence of men's actions according to our natural sense is so far from being essential to the morality or merit of those actions that it would destroy it, and that, on the contrary, the dependence of our actions on such causes as inward inclinations, incitements, and ends is essential to the being of it. Natural sense teaches men, when they see anything done by others of a good or evil tendency, to inquire what their intention was, what principles and views they were moved by, in order to judge how far they are to be justified or condemned, and not to determine that in order to their being approved or blamed at all, the action must be performed altogether fortuitously, proceeding from nothing, arising from no cause. Concerning this matter I have fully expressed my mind in the inquiry. If the liberty of which we have a natural sense as necessary to desert consists in the mind's self-determination without being determined by previous inclination or motive, then indifference is essential to it, yea, absolute indifference, as is observed in my inquiry. But men naturally have no notion of any such liberty as this, as essential to the morality or demerit of their actions. But on the contrary, such a liberty, if it were possible, would be inconsistent with our natural notions of desert, as is largely shown in the inquiry. If it be agreeable to natural sense that men must be indifferent in determining their own actions, then according to the same, the more they are determined by inclination, either good or bad, the less they have of desert. The more good actions are performed from good disposition, the less praiseworthy, and the more evil deeds are from evil dispositions, the less culpable, and in general the more men's actions are from their hearts, the less they are to be commended or condemned, which all must know is very contrary to natural sense. Moral necessity is owing to the power and government of the inclination of the heart, either habitual or occasional, excited by motive. But according to natural and common sense, the more a man does anything with full inclination of heart, the more is it to be charged to his account for his condemnation, if it be an ill action, and the more to be ascribed to him for his praise, if it be good. If the mind were determined to evil actions by contingence from a state of indifference, then either there would be no fault in them, or else the fault would be in being so perfectly indifferent that the mind was equally liable to a bad or good determination. And if this indifference be liberty, then the very essence of the blame or fault would lie in the liberty itself, or the wickedness would, primarily and summarily, lie in being a free agent. If there were no fault in being indifferent, then there would be no fault in the determination being agreeable to such a state of indifference. That is, there could be no fault found that opposite determinations actually happen to take place indifferently, sometimes good and sometimes bad, as contingent governs and decides. And if it be a fault to be indifferent to good and evil, then such indifference is no indifference to good and evil, but is a determination to evil or to a fault. And such an indifferent disposition would be an evil disposition, tendency, or determination of mind. So inconsistent are these notions of liberty as essential to praise or blame. The author of the essay supposes men's natural delusive sense of liberty of contingence to be in truth the foundation of all the labor, care, and industry of mankind, and that if man's practical ideas had been formed on the plan of universal necessity, the ignawa ratio, the inactive doctrine of the Stoics, would have followed, and that there would have been no room for forethought about futurity or any sort of industry and care, plainly implying that in this case men would see and know that all their industry and care signified nothing, was in vain, and to no purpose or of no benefit, events being fixed in an irrefragable chain, and not at all depending on their care and endeavor. As he explains himself particularly in the instance of men's use of means to prolong life, not only very contrary to what I largely maintained in my inquiry, but also very inconsistently with his own scheme and what he supposes of the ends for which God has so deeply implanted this deceitful feeling in man's nature, in which he manifestly supposes men's care and industry not to be in vain and of no benefit, but of great use, yea, of absolute necessity, in order to their obtaining the most important ends and necessary purposes of human life, and to fulfill the ends of action to the best advantage, as he largely declares. Now how shall these things be reconciled? That if men had a clear view of real truth, they would see that there was no room for their care and industry, because they would see it to be in vain and of no benefit. And yet that God, by having a clear view of real truth, sees their being excited to care and industry will be of excellent use to mankind, and greatly for the benefit of the world, yea, absolutely necessary in order to it, and that therefore the great wisdom and goodness of God to men appears in artfully contriving to put them on care and industry for their good, which good could not be obtained without them. And yet both these things are maintained at once and in the same sentences and words by this author. The very reason he gives why God has put this deceitful feeling into men contradicts and destroys itself, that God, in his great goodness to men, gave them such a deceitful feeling because it was very useful and necessary for them, and greatly for their benefit, or excites them to care and industry for their own good, which care and industry is useful and necessary to that end. And yet the very thing for which as a reason this great benefit of care and industry is given is God's deceiving men in this very point, and making them think their care and industry to be of great benefit to them, when indeed it is of none at all. And if they saw the real truth, they would see all their endeavors to be wholly useless, that there was no room for them, and that the event does not at all depend upon them. And besides, what this author says plainly implies, as appears by what has been already observed, that it is necessary men should be deceived by being made to believe that future events are contingent, and their own future actions free, with such a freedom as signifies that their actions are not the fruit of their own desires or designs, but altogether contingent, fortuitous, and without a cause. But how should a notion of liberty consisting in accident or loose chance encourage care and industry? I should think it would rather entirely discourage everything of this nature, for surely if our actions do not depend on our desires and designs, then they do not depend on our endeavors flowing from our desires and designs. This author himself seems to suppose that if men had indeed such a liberty of contingence, it would render all endeavors to determine or move men's future volitions in vain. He says that in this case to exhort, to instruct, to promise, or to threaten would be to no purpose. Why? Because, as he himself gives the reason, then our will would be capricious and arbitrary, and we should be thrown loose altogether, and our arbitrary power could do us good or ill only by accident. But if such a loose, fortuitous state would render vain others' endeavors upon us, for the same reason would it make useless our endeavors on ourselves. For events that are truly contingent and accidental, and altogether loose from and independent of all foregoing causes, are independent on every foregoing cause within ourselves as well as in others. I suppose that it is so far from being true that our minds are naturally possessed with a notion of such liberty as this, so strongly that it is impossible to root it out, that indeed men have no such notion of liberty at all, and that it is utterly impossible by any means whatsoever to implant or introduce such a notion into the mind, as no such notions as imply self-contradiction and self-abolition can subsist in the mind, as I have shown in my inquiry. I think a mature, sensible consideration of the matter is sufficient to satisfy any one, that even the greatest and most learned advocates themselves for liberty of indifference and self-determination have no such notion, and that indeed they mean something wholly inconsistent with and directly subversive of what they strenuously affirm and earnestly contend for. By a man having a power of determining his own will, they plainly mean a power of determining his will as he pleases or as he chooses, which supposes that the mind has a choice prior to its going about to confirm any action or determination to it. And if they mean that they determine even the original or prime choice by their own pleasure or choice as the thing that causes and directs it, I scruple not most boldly to affirm that they speak they know not what, and that of which they have no manner of idea, because no such contradictory notion can come into or have a moment's subsistence in the mind of any man living, as an original or first choice being caused or brought into being by choice. After all, they say they have no higher or other conception of liberty than that vulgar notion of it which I contend for, viz., a man's having power or opportunity to do as he chooses. Or if they had a notion that every act of choice was determined by choice, yet it would destroy their notion of the contingents of choice, for then no one act of choice would arise contingently or from a state of indifference, but every individual act in all the series would arise from foregoing bias or preference, and from a cause predetermining and fixing its existence, which introduces at once such a chain of causes and effects, each preceding link decisively fixing the following, as they would by all means avoid. And such kind of delusion and self-contradiction as this does not arise in men's minds by nature. It is not owing to any natural feeling which God has strongly fixed in the mind and nature of man, but to false philosophy and strong prejudice from a deceitful abuse of words. It is artificial, not in the sense of the author of the essay supposing it to be a deceitful artifice of God, but artificial as opposed to natural, and is owing to an artificial, deceitful management of terms to darken and confound the mind. Men have no such thing when they first begin to exercise reason, but must have a great deal of time to blind themselves with metaphysical confusion before they can embrace and rest in such definitions of liberty as are given, and imagine they understand them. On the whole, I humbly conceive that whosoever will give himself the trouble of weighing what I have offered to consideration in my inquiry must be sensible that such a moral necessity of men's actions as I maintain is not at all inconsistent with any liberty that any creature has or can have as a free, accountable moral agent and subject of moral government, and that this moral necessity is so far from being inconsistent with praise and blame and the benefit and use of men's own care and labor, that on the contrary it implies the very ground and reason why men's actions are to be ascribed to them as their own, in such a manner as to infer desert, praise and blame, approbation and remorse of conscience, reward and punishment, and that it establishes the moral system of the universe and God's moral government in every respect, with the proper use of motives, exhortations, commands, counsels, promises, and threatenings, and the use and benefit of endeavors, care, and industry. There is therefore no need that the strict philosophic truth should be at all concealed, nor is there any danger in contemplation and profound discovery in these things. So far from this, that the truth in this matter is of vast importance and extremely needful to be known, and the more clearly and perfectly the real fact is known, and the more constantly it is in view, the better, more particularly that the clear and full knowledge of that which is the true system of the universe in these respects would greatly establish the doctrines which teach the true Christian scheme of divine administration in the city of God and the gospel of Jesus Christ in its most important articles. Indeed, these things never can be well established, and the opposite errors, so subversive of the whole gospel, which at this day so greatly and generally prevail, be well confuted, or the arguments by which they are maintained answered, till these points are settled. While this is not done, it is to me beyond doubt that the friends of those great gospel truths will but poorly maintain their controversy with the adversaries of those truths. They will be obliged often to shuffle, hide, and turn their backs, and the latter will have a strong fort from whence they never can be driven, and weapons to use from which those whom they oppose will find no shield to screen themselves, and they will always puzzle, confound, and keep under the friends of sound doctrine, and glory and vaunt themselves in their advantage over them, and carry their affairs with a high hand, as they have done already for a long time past. I conclude, sir, with asking your pardon for troubling you with so much in vindication of myself, from the imputation of advancing a scheme of necessity like that of the author of the Essays on the Principles of Morality and Natural Religion. Considering that what I have said is not only in vindication of myself, but as I think of the most important articles of moral philosophy and religion, I trust in what I know of your candor that you will excuse your obliged friend and brother, J. Edwards. Stockbridge, July 25th, 1757. End of Part 4, Section 15. End of The Freedom of the Will by Jonathan Edwards.